Have you ever wondered how a foreign woman from a despised nation could become the great-grandmother of the greatest king in Israel's history? Today, we're diving into one of the most remarkable stories in the Bible, a story that reveals God's incredible plan hidden in the most unlikely places. Ruth wasn't just any ordinary woman. She was a Moabite, from a people that Israel considered enemies. Yet somehow, this outsider would change the entire course of biblical history. Her name appears in the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. But how did this happen? What was the secret that transformed a foreign widow into one of the most celebrated women in Scripture? Get ready to discover the hidden truths about Ruth that most people never notice. We'll uncover the deeper meaning behind her famous declaration of loyalty, explore the shocking cultural barriers she overcame, and reveal how her story points directly to the coming Messiah. This isn't just a beautiful love story, it's a masterpiece of divine providence that will change how you see God's plan for your own life. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Ruth's story is far more significant than you ever imagined, and how her journey from outsider to ancestor of kings demonstrates God's heart for all people, regardless of their background. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how impossible Ruth's situation really was. Imagine being a young woman in ancient times, completely dependent on men for survival and protection. Now imagine losing your husband, having no children to care for you in your old age, and being left with nothing but an aging mother-in-law who has also lost everything. That was Ruth's reality. But here's where it gets even more challenging. She wasn't even from the right people group. The Moabites and Israelites had a complicated history, to put it mildly. These weren't just different nations. They were enemies with deep-seated animosity going back generations. The Moabites descended from Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter after fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah. This shameful origin story created a permanent stain on their reputation among God's chosen people. But the hostility went far deeper than ancient family drama. In Deuteronomy, God's law explicitly stated that no Ammonite or Moabite could enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Why such harsh treatment? Because when Israel was wandering in the wilderness after escaping Egypt, the Moabites refused to help them. Instead of offering bread and water to their distant relatives, they hired the prophet Balaam to curse Israel. This wasn't just political tension, this was divine judgment. The Moabites had chosen to stand against God's people at their most vulnerable moment, and the consequences would echo through history. For a Moabite woman to even consider joining herself to an Israelite family was almost unthinkable. Yet here was Ruth, facing a choice that would define not only her future, but the future of nations. The story begins with a famine in Bethlehem. Isn't it ironic that Bethlehem, whose name literally means house of bread, was experiencing such severe hunger that families had to leave their ancestral lands? This wasn't just economic hardship in ancient Israel. Famine was often seen as a sign of God's displeasure, a call to examine one's relationship with the Almighty. Elimelech, whose name means "My God is King," made a decision that would have shocked his neighbors. Rather than trusting God to provide during the difficult times in the Promised Land, he packed up his family and moved to Moab. His wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, left behind everything familiar to start over in foreign territory. This move was more than just relocating, it was a statement of faith, or perhaps a lack thereof. By leaving the land God had given to his people, Elimelech was essentially saying he trusted Moab's grain more than God's provision. Little did he know that this decision, which seemed so practical at the time, would set in motion events that would reshape biblical history. The family settled in Moab, and for a while, things seemed to work out. The boys grew up, and eventually they married local women, Orpah and Ruth. These marriages, while providing companionship and hope for the future, created another layer of complexity. Marrying foreign wives wasn't explicitly forbidden, but it was strongly discouraged because of the spiritual dangers it posed. But then tragedy struck with devastating force. First, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. She now depended entirely on her 2 sons for protection and provision. Then, in what must have seemed like a cruel twist of fate, both Mahlon and Chilion died as well, leaving 3 widows with no male relatives to care for them. In our modern context, it's hard to fully grasp how desperate their situation was. These weren't just personal losses, they were economic catastrophes. Without husbands or sons, these women had virtually no legal rights, no source of income, and no security for their future. They were among the most vulnerable people in society. Naomi found herself in the worst possible position. She was a foreigner in Moab with no family connections, but she was also too old to remarry and start over. Her only hope was to return to Bethlehem and throw herself on the mercy of whatever distant relatives might still remember her family. But what about her daughters-in-law? They were young enough to remarry, but only if they stayed in their homeland where they had family connections and cultural understanding. If they followed Naomi to Israel, they would face the same challenges she faced in Moab, being foreigners in a land that might not welcome them. This is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Naomi made the difficult decision to return to Bethlehem, and initially, both Orpah and Ruth insisted on accompanying her. But as they walked along the road that would take them away from everything familiar, Naomi stopped and delivered a speech that reveals the depth of her despair and love. She urged her daughters-in-law to return to their mothers' houses, to find new husbands among their own people, to build new lives, rather than following her into an uncertain future. Her words were both practical and heartbreaking. "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Naomi was acknowledging the harsh reality of their situation. In that culture, if a woman's husband died without children, she could marry his brother to continue the family line. This was called levirate marriage. But Naomi had no more sons, and she was too old to have more children. She was offering her daughters-in-law the gift of freedom to pursue happiness elsewhere. The 3 women wept together on that dusty road, clinging to each other in their shared grief. Orpah, after much anguish, finally accepted Naomi's counsel. She kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and turned back toward Moab, toward the familiar, toward the possibility of a new beginning among her own people. But Ruth refused to leave. What happened next would echo through generations and change the course of biblical history. Ruth's response wasn't just an emotional declaration of loyalty. It was a conscious choice to abandon everything familiar and cast her lot with God's people, even when God's people seemed to be under judgment. Her words have become some of the most quoted in all of Scripture. But do we really understand what she was saying? Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. This wasn't just a touching expression of devotion to her mother-in-law. Ruth was making a covenant declaration, choosing to identify completely with Israel and Israel's God, even though she had every reason to believe this choice would lead to poverty, rejection, and hardship. Think about the courage this required. Ruth was choosing to leave behind her family, her culture, her religion, and her chances for a normal life. She was choosing to follow an embittered old woman back to a land where she would be viewed with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. But there's something even more remarkable about Ruth's decision. She wasn't just choosing Naomi, she was choosing Naomi's God. "Your God will be my God" wasn't just a polite way of saying she'd go along with local customs. It was a declaration of faith that would cost her everything she had known. Ruth was essentially converting to Judaism at a time when such conversion was almost unheard of. She was choosing to worship the God of Israel, to follow his laws, to become part of his people, even though his people were currently experiencing famine and loss. This decision reveals something profound about Ruth's character. Despite witnessing the deaths of the men in this family, despite seeing Naomi's bitterness and despair, Ruth somehow recognized that the God of Israel was worth following. She saw something in Naomi's faith, even in its broken state, that convinced her this was the path to choose. Her final words in that famous declaration are often overlooked, but they're perhaps the most significant. "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Ruth wasn't just making a promise for the immediate future, she was committing her entire life, even her death and burial, to this new identity. She was burning every bridge back to her old life and stepping forward in faith toward an uncertain future. This is where Ruth's story becomes more than just a touching tale of family loyalty. Her decision represents something revolutionary in the ancient world, the idea that someone could choose to join God's people, regardless of their ethnic background or national origin. The two women continued their journey to Bethlehem, but they were no longer the same people who had left Moab. Naomi was returning as a bitter widow who felt abandoned by God. Ruth was arriving as something entirely new, a Moabite who had chosen to become an Israelite, a foreigner who had chosen to trust in Israel's God. Little did either of them know that this seemingly tragic return would set the stage for one of the most beautiful redemption stories in all of Scripture. Ruth's choice to follow Naomi wasn't just changing her own destiny, it was positioning her to become a crucial part of God's plan for all humanity. The journey that began with loss and famine was about to become a story of provision, love, and divine purpose that would impact generations yet unborn. Ruth's hidden secret wasn't just her loyalty to Naomi, it was her recognition that the God of Israel was worth following, even when following him seemed to lead to hardship and uncertainty. But this is only the beginning of Ruth's incredible journey. What happened when these two widows arrived in Bethlehem would reveal just how far God was willing to go to include an outsider in his grand plan of redemption. When Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, their entrance wasn't exactly triumphant. Picture two dusty, travel-worn women walking into a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The timing of their arrival tells us something crucial about God's providence. They came at the beginning of barley harvest, just when opportunities for survival would be most abundant. But the reception they received revealed just how dramatically their circumstances had changed. When the women of the town saw Naomi, they could hardly believe their eyes. "Can this be Naomi?" they whispered among themselves. The woman who had left Bethlehem as a prosperous wife and mother had returned broken and empty-handed. Naomi's response to their recognition cut straight to the heart. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara. because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The name Naomi means pleasant or my delight, while Mara means bitter. This wasn't just a woman feeling sorry for herself. This was someone grappling with what felt like divine abandonment. She had followed her husband to Moab seeking relief from famine, only to lose everything that mattered to her. But notice what the townspeople couldn't see yet. While Naomi felt empty, she hadn't actually returned alone. Standing quietly beside her was Ruth, whose presence would prove to be anything but empty. The very fact that a Moabite woman had accompanied Naomi back to Bethlehem was extraordinary, yet most people probably didn't grasp its significance at first. Ruth now faced the harsh reality of her choice. She was in a foreign land where her accent would immediately identify her as an outsider. Her very appearance might have marked her as different. Most challenging of all, she needed to find a way to provide for both herself and her aging mother-in-law in a society where she had no connections, no reputation, and no rights. This is where Ruth's character truly begins to shine. Rather than wallowing in self-pity or regretting her decision, she immediately took action. She approached Naomi with a proposal that would have required tremendous courage. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." This simple request reveals volumes about Ruth's understanding of her new situation. She was proposing to engage in gleaning, a practice that was essentially legalized, begging for the poorest members of society. Mosaic law required farmers to leave the corners of their fields unharvested and not to gather grain that fell during reaping, specifically so that widows, orphans, and foreigners could collect enough food to survive. But gleaning wasn't without its dangers, especially for a young foreign woman. She would be working in fields owned by men she didn't know, alongside workers who might view her with suspicion or worse. There was always the risk of harassment, exploitation, or outright rejection. Yet Ruth was willing to face these dangers to provide for Naomi. Naomi's response, "Go ahead," my daughter, shows both her desperation and her recognition of Ruth's determination. She couldn't provide for them both, and she knew Ruth's offer was their only hope for survival. Here's where the story takes a turn that reveals God's invisible hand guiding events. Ruth went out to glean, but she didn't just randomly choose any field. The text tells us she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who happened to be a relative of Naomi's late husband Elimelech. That phrase, "found herself," is loaded with meaning. In Hebrew, it suggests something that appeared to happen by chance, but was actually orchestrated by divine providence. Ruth thought she was simply looking for the most promising place to gather grain, but God was positioning her exactly where she needed to be. Boaz wasn't just any landowner. He was what the Hebrews called a kinsman redeemer, a close relative who had both the right and responsibility to help distressed family members. But at this point, neither Ruth nor Boaz fully understood the significance of their meeting. When Boaz first noticed Ruth among the gleaners, he asked his foreman about her. The response tells us something important about how Ruth was already being perceived. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She was being defined by her foreign origin, but also by her connection to Naomi and her choice to return with her. What happened next demonstrates the kind of character that had attracted Ruth to follow Naomi's God in the first place. When Boaz learned who Ruth was, instead of treating her with the suspicion typically shown to Moabites, he showed her extraordinary kindness. He told her not to glean in any other field, to stay close to his female servants for protection, and to drink from the water jars his men had filled. These weren't just polite gestures, they were acts of protection and provision that went far beyond what the law required. Ruth's response reveals her humility and wisdom. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner?" She recognized that Boaz's treatment of her was exceptional, and she wanted to understand why. Boaz's answer is one of the most beautiful statements in the entire book. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." Notice what impressed Boaz most. It wasn't Ruth's beauty or her potential as a wife. It was her character, her loyalty, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for Naomi. He saw in Ruth the same kind of faith that had characterized Abraham when he left his homeland to follow God's calling. But then Boaz said something that revealed his spiritual insight. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz recognized that Ruth's decision to follow Naomi wasn't just about family loyalty, it was about finding refuge under the wings of Israel's God. He saw her conversion as genuine and her commitment as complete. This wasn't a foreign woman trying to take advantage of Israelite customs. This was someone who had truly chosen to trust in the God of Israel. The image of taking refuge under God's wings is particularly powerful. It suggests not just protection, but also the kind of intimate care a mother bird provides for her young. Boaz was acknowledging that Ruth had found more than just a new nationality. She had found a new spiritual identity. At mealtime, Boaz invited Ruth to eat with his workers, another extraordinary gesture of acceptance and provision. He personally served her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied with some left over. This detail might seem insignificant, but for someone who had been facing starvation, it was a powerful sign of God's provision. When Ruth returned to work, Boaz secretly instructed his men to leave extra grain for her and not to rebuke her even if she gathered from among the sheaves themselves, something normally forbidden to gleaners. His generosity went far beyond legal requirements into the realm of genuine care and protection. That evening, Ruth returned to Naomi with an ephah of barley, roughly half a bushel, an almost impossible amount for a gleaner to collect in a single day. When Naomi saw how much grain Ruth had brought home, she immediately knew something unusual had happened. "Where did you glean today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." When Ruth told her about Boaz, Naomi's response revealed that she understood the deeper significance of what had occurred. "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." Then Naomi dropped a bombshell that would change everything. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsmen, redeemers." Suddenly, what had seemed like a fortunate coincidence took on much greater meaning. Ruth hadn't just stumbled into a kind master's field. She had been providentially guided to a man who had both the legal right and the financial ability to redeem their family's fortunes. The concept of kinsman-redeemer was central to Israelite law and culture. When a family fell into poverty or distress, their closest male relative had the responsibility to buy back any land they had sold, pay their debts, and even marry their widows to continue the family line. It was a social safety net designed to prevent families from disappearing entirely. But there was a problem. Boaz was a relative, but he might not be the closest one. According to the law, the nearest kinsman had the first right and responsibility to redeem. If there was someone closer than Boaz, he would have to defer to that person's decision. This legal complexity sets up the tension that drives the rest of Ruth's story. Here was a man who clearly cared for Ruth and had the means to redeem their situation, but he might not have the legal right to do so. Ruth's future and the future of Naomi's family line hung in the balance of ancient legal proceedings. Naomi, recognizing the opportunity that God had placed before them, began to formulate a plan that would require Ruth to take an enormous risk. What she proposed would either result in their redemption and Ruth's security, or it could destroy Ruth's reputation and leave them worse off than before. The stage was now set for one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Bible, a midnight encounter on a threshing floor that would determine not just Ruth's fate, but the fate of generations yet unborn. Ruth's hidden secret was about to be revealed in ways that would transform her from a foreign gleaner into a woman whose name would be remembered forever. The woman who had chosen to follow Naomi's God into uncertainty was about to discover just how far that God would go to honor her faith and weave her story into his grand plan of redemption. The plan that Naomi devised would test Ruth's faith and courage like nothing she had faced before. As the barley harvest came to an end and the wheat harvest began, Naomi watched Boaz's continued kindness toward Ruth and recognized that something deeper was stirring. But she also knew that without decisive action, this budding relationship might never move beyond polite generosity. One evening, as the sun set over the fields of Bethlehem, Naomi called Ruth aside. Her words carried the weight of desperation mixed with hope. "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Tonight, Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." What Naomi proposed next would have shocked anyone listening. She instructed Ruth to wash herself, put on perfume, dress in her best clothes, and go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be working late into the night. But she wasn't to reveal herself until after he had finished eating and drinking and had lain down to sleep. Then came the most startling part of the plan. Ruth was to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down beside him. In our modern context, this might sound inappropriate or even scandalous, but Naomi was actually orchestrating a carefully choreographed legal proceeding disguised as a romantic encounter. The threshing floor wasn't just a place of agricultural work, it was a location where important legal and business transactions often took place. By positioning herself at Boaz's feet, Ruth would be making a symbolic claim for protection and redemption. She would essentially be asking him to spread his covering over her, to take her under his wing, the same imagery Boaz had used when he spoke of God's protection over Ruth. But the risk was enormous. If Boaz misunderstood her intentions, if he rejected her claim, or if anyone else discovered her there, Ruth's reputation would be destroyed. A foreign woman found lying beside a prominent Israelite man in the middle of the night could face accusations that would ruin any chance she had of finding acceptance in Bethlehem. Ruth's response to this dangerous plan reveals the depth of her trust in Naomi and her commitment to their shared future. "I will do whatever you say." Once again, Ruth was choosing to risk everything based on faith rather than fear. That night, Ruth carried out Naomi's instructions with precision. She prepared herself carefully, made her way to the threshing floor, and waited in the shadows until Boaz had finished his work. The text tells us he ate and drank and was in good spirits. This wasn't a man drowning his sorrows, but someone content with his life and work. After Boaz lay down beside the grain pile to guard it through the night, Ruth quietly approached and uncovered his feet before lying down at the spot she had uncovered. Then she waited, her heart pounding, for whatever would happen when he discovered her presence. Around midnight, something startled Boaz awake. Perhaps it was the cool night air on his uncovered feet, or maybe some sixth sense that he wasn't alone. When he turned and saw a figure lying at his feet, his shock is evident in his words, "Who are you?" Ruth's response was both humble and bold. "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." With these carefully chosen words, Ruth was making a formal request for marriage and redemption. She was reminding Boaz of his legal obligations while also expressing her trust in his character. The phrase, "spread the corner of your garment over me," carried deep cultural and religious significance. It was the same language used to describe God's covenant relationship with Israel. Ruth was asking Boaz to make her his wife, but she was doing so within the framework of Israel's redemption laws, not as a romantic advance. Boaz's response exceeded even Ruth's boldest hopes. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." What Boaz recognized in Ruth's request was another act of hesed, the same loyal love she had shown to Naomi. Ruth could have sought a younger husband, someone who might offer her more years of companionship and more children. Instead, she was choosing to marry within Naomi's family line, ensuring that her deceased husband's name and inheritance would be preserved. But then Boaz revealed the complication that Naomi had suspected. "Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I." There was another relative who had the first right to redeem Ruth and Naomi's situation. According to the law, Boaz couldn't act until that person either accepted the responsibility or formally declined it. However, Boaz's next words showed his commitment to seeing Ruth's request fulfilled. "Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it." This oath wasn't just a promise, it was a covenant declaration made in God's name. Boaz was pledging his honor and his relationship with God as guarantee that Ruth would not be left without a redeemer. Ruth spent the rest of the night at Boaz's feet, but nothing improper occurred. When dawn began to break, Boaz helped her up and filled her shawl with 6 measures of barley, another generous gift, but also a message for Naomi that he was serious about redemption. His parting words to Ruth were significant. "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." This wasn't shame about what had happened, but wisdom about protecting Ruth's reputation until the legal matters could be properly resolved. When Ruth returned home, Naomi's first question revealed her anxiety. "How did it go, my daughter?" Ruth recounted everything that had happened, including Boaz's promise and the gift of grain. Naomi's response showed her understanding of Boaz's character. "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." True to his word, Boaz wasted no time in addressing the legal complications. Early that morning, he went to the town gate, the ancient equivalent of a courthouse where legal matters were settled. This wasn't a private family arrangement he was pursuing, but a public legal proceeding that would affect property rights, inheritance laws, and family obligations. The town gate was where the elders gathered each morning to conduct business, settle disputes, and witness important transactions. It was the most public and official venue available for the kind of legal proceeding Boaz needed to initiate. When the nearer kinsman happened to pass by, another example of divine timing, Boaz called out to him using a phrase that essentially meant, "Hey, you there." The text doesn't give us this man's actual name, referring to him only as so-and-so, which suggests that history would not remember him kindly for what was about to unfold. Boaz then gathered 10 of the town elders to serve as witnesses, the number required for official legal proceedings. With the proper legal framework in place, he laid out the situation with careful precision. First, he mentioned that Naomi was selling the piece of land that had belonged to their relative Elimelech. This was the first time we learned that Naomi had property to sell, but it makes sense she would need to liquidate any assets to survive, and the law required that family land be offered to relatives before being sold to outsiders. The closer kinsman immediately expressed interest in purchasing the land. After all, it was a good investment opportunity and would increase his own holdings while fulfilling his family obligations. But then Boaz revealed the catch. On the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you also acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. This changed everything. Buying the land was one thing. It was a straightforward business transaction that would benefit the purchaser. But marrying Ruth meant taking on significant additional responsibilities. Any children from that marriage would inherit the redeemed land, effectively meaning the kinsman would be paying to buy property that would ultimately belong to someone else's heirs. The closer kinsman's response reveals both his character and his short-sightedness. Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. With those words, he forfeited not only his right to the land, but also his place in biblical history. He chose immediate self-interest over family obligation, financial security over faithful service. He couldn't see past the potential cost to recognize the incredible honor he was declining. To make the transfer of rights official, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz. This ancient custom served as a binding contract, witnessed by all the elders present. The sandal represented the right to walk on and possess the land, and its transfer symbolized the complete relinquishing of that right. Boaz then made a public declaration that would echo through history. Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Notice the language Boaz used. He didn't say he was taking Ruth as his wife, but that he had acquired her as part of the redemption. This wasn't romantic language, it was legal terminology that established Ruth's new status and secured her future. The elders and all the people at the gate responded with a blessing that revealed their recognition of what was happening. We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. This blessing was extraordinary. They were comparing Ruth, a Moabite woman, to the founding mothers of Israel. They were essentially declaring that this foreign woman had the potential to build up God's people, just as the matriarchs had done generations earlier. But their blessing went even further. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. The reference to Perez is particularly significant. Perez was born from another unconventional union between Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, who had disguised herself to ensure the continuation of the family line. Like Ruth's story, Tamar's involved a foreign woman, legal complications, and a dramatic nighttime encounter that led to redemption and blessing. The elders were prophetically declaring that Ruth's offspring would be significant in Israel's history, just as Perez had been. They couldn't have known that they were blessing the great-grandmother of King David, but their words carried divine weight nonetheless. So Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and the Lord enabled her to conceive. After years of barrenness during her first marriage, Ruth now carried the child who would secure not only her future, but also Naomi's legacy and, ultimately, the messianic line itself. When the son was born, the women of Bethlehem gathered around Naomi with congratulations that revealed how completely Ruth had been accepted into the community. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. Ruth's story reveals the magnificent truth that God's plans often work through the most unlikely people in the most unexpected ways. This Moabite woman, who had every reason to turn back, instead chose faith over fear, loyalty over comfort, and God's people over her own. Her courage to step into the unknown transformed her from an outsider into an ancestor of kings, proving that when we align ourselves with God's purposes, He can use anyone to change the course of history itself.